On a cold afternoon late in March 1995, I took my first extended trip overseas without the president, a 12-day official visit to 5 countries in South Asia. The State Department had asked me to visit the subcontinent to highlight the administration's commitment to the region and to assure leaders throughout South Asia that Bill supported their efforts to strengthen democracy, expand free markets, and promote tolerance and human rights, including the rights of women. I wanted to meet with as many women as possible to stress the correlation between women's progress and a country's social and economic status. The Chinese have an ancient saying that women hold up half the sky, but in most of the world, it's really more than half. Women handle a large share of the responsibility for the welfare of their families, yet their work often goes unrecognized and unrewarded inside the family or by the formal economy. These inequities are starkly visible in South Asia, where more than 500 million people live in grinding poverty, the majority of them women and children. Poor women and girls are oppressed and discriminated against, denied education and medical care, and victimized by culturally sanctioned violence. Law enforcement often turns a blind eye to the crimes of wife-beating, bride-burning, and female infanticide. And in certain communities, women who are raped can be jailed for adultery. My most vivid memories of India were not of the Taj Mahal, breathtaking as it was, but of a visit I made in the city of Ahmedabad, in the state of Gujarat. The visit was to Mahatma Gandhi's simple ashram, where he sought a meditative retreat from the roiling struggle to create an independent India. Gandhi's life and principles of self-reliance and rejection of the caste system inspired a remarkable woman, Ella Bhatt. She founded the Self-Employed Women's Association called SEWA in 1971. Both a trade union and a women's movement, SEWA claimed over 140,000 members, including some of the poorest, least educated, and most shunned women in India. These women entered into arranged marriages and then lived in their husbands' households under the watchful eyes of their mothers-in-law. Some had lived in Purdah until their husbands died, were disabled, or left, and they had to support their families. All struggled day to day to survive. SEWA offered small loans to enable them to earn their own income and also provided basic literacy and business education training. One by one, women told me how SEWA had changed their lives. One woman struck a common chord when she explained that she was no longer afraid of her mother-in-law. She added that she was no longer afraid of the police either, because a group of SEWA-sponsored vendors now protected her from harassment by overbearing officers in the market. I was still thinking of their faces and words the next day as we flew from sea level to Nepal's capital, Kathmandu, in the middle of the Himalayan mountains. The landscapes of Nepal are among the most beautiful in the world, but the inhabited regions of the country are overcrowded. Human waste is used for fertilizer, and clean water is a rarity. The Americans I met all had stories of getting sick after spending time in Nepal, making it sound like an inevitable rite of passage. After a courtesy visit to the Royal Palace, the next morning Chelsea and I visited a women's health clinic founded by American women living in Nepal. Nepal had one of the world's highest maternal and infant death rates. The clinic employed a common-sense, low-tech approach to preventive care and had established a program to provide pregnant women and midwives with safe home delivery kits. The kits contained a plastic sheet, a bar of soap, a piece of twine, wax, and a razor blade. In Nepal, a plastic sheet for a woman in labor to lie on, soap for the midwife to clean her hands and utensils, string to tie off the umbilical cord, and a clean razor blade to cut it can make the difference between life and death to a mother and her newborn. Bangladesh, the most densely populated country on earth, presented the starkest contrast of wealth and poverty I saw in South Asia. I had first learned about the Grameen Bank more than a decade earlier, when Bill and I invited the bank's founder, Dr. Mohammed Yunus, to Little Rock to discuss how microcredit lending programs might help some of the poorest rural communities in Arkansas. The Grameen Bank provides loans to very poor women who have no other access to credit. But its triumphs in helping landless women gain self-sufficiency have made the Grameen Bank and similar programs a target for Islamic fundamentalists. 2 days before we arrived in Dhaka, some 2,000 extremists marched on the capital to denounce secular aid organizations, which they accused of tempting women to defy a strict interpretation of the Quran. In the months before our visit, village banks and girls' schools had been torched, and one of Bangladesh's leading women writers had received death threats. Our visit to the Grameen Bank in one of the Bangladeshi villages was worth battling the crowds and the long, bumpy ride. I had been invited to visit 2 villages, one Hindu and one Muslim, but could not manage both because of my schedule. Remarkably, the Muslim women decided to come to the Hindu village for our meeting. I sat under a thatched pavilion, and the women told me how they had all come together, defying the fundamentalists. I told them I was there to listen to them and to learn. A Muslim woman stood up and said, "We are sick of the mullahs. They are always trying to keep women down." I asked what sorts of problems they faced, and she said, "They threaten to ban us if we take loans from the bank. They tell us the bank people will steal our children. I tell them to leave us alone. We are trying to help our children have better lives." I wasn't the only one moved by the village women. One of the American journalists who stood near me listening to our discussion leaned in and whispered, "Silence is not spoken here." When we arrived in Beijing, it was after midnight. I had time for only a few hours of sleep. The plenary hall where I spoke looked like a mini United Nations. In the audience, I saw women and men of all complexions and races, some in Western garb and many dressed in their nation's traditional clothing. I wanted my speech to be simple, accessible, and unambiguous in its message that women's rights are not separate from or a subsidiary of human rights. I wanted to convey how important it is for women to make choices for themselves in their lives. I also wanted to push the envelope in this speech, which meant being clear about the injustice of the Chinese government's behavior. Although I didn't mention China or any other country by name, there was little doubt about the egregious human rights violators to whom I was referring as I spoke. I believe that on the eve of a new millennium, it is time to break our silence. It is time for us to say here in Beijing, and the world to hear, that it is no longer acceptable to discuss women's rights as separate from human rights. For too long, the history of women has been a history of silence. Even today, there are those who are trying to silence our words. The voices of this conference and of the women at Huairou must be heard loud and clear. It is a violation of human rights when babies are denied food or drowned or suffocated or their spines broken simply because they are born girls. It is a violation of human rights when women and girls are sold into the slavery of prostitution. It is a violation of human rights when women are doused with gasoline, set on fire, and burned to death because their marriage dowries are deemed too small. It is a violation of human rights when individual women are raped in their own communities and when thousands of women are subjected to rape as a tactic or prize of war. It is a violation of human rights when a leading cause of death worldwide among women ages 14 to 44 is the violence they are subjected to in their own homes by their own relatives. It is a violation of human rights when young girls are brutalized by the painful and degrading practice of genital mutilation. It is a violation of human rights when women are denied the right to plan their own families, and that includes being forced to have abortions or being sterilized against their will. If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights, and that women's rights are human rights, once and for all. When the last words left my lips, the serious and stony-faced delegates suddenly leaped from their seats to give me a standing ovation. What I didn't know at the time was that my 21-minute speech would become a manifesto for women all over the world. The reaction of the Chinese government was not so positive. I learned later that the government had blacked out my speech from closed-circuit TV in the conference hall. The day after the Beijing speech, I went to Huairou to speak to the NGO representatives whose forum had been exiled from the main conference. It was a gloomy day. Due to rain, the forum had been moved inside a converted movie house. The Chinese police, through their harsh tactics outside the hall, had done an extraordinary job of energizing the NGO representatives who sang, yelled, clapped, and cheered as I walked on stage. I loved the feeling of the crowd and told them how much I admired and championed the work these groups did, often in dangerous situations, to build and sustain civil society and democracy. Then I read Silence, the poem written for me by the student in New Delhi. It seemed to be the perfect antidote to the Chinese government's suppression of the NGO Forum and its attempts to silence the words and ideas of so many women. Flying home, I thought about how I may have gotten the headlines on this trip, but it was the women I had met whose lives and achievements against great odds deserved the world's respect. They sure had mine.